Awesome. Okay, and we're live on YouTube. Thank you again for everybody who's joining these calls. This is the Open RFC deep dive call, which we're essentially running bi-weekly, alternating with the Open RFC call, where NPM and the community essentially are going through sort of the backlog of RFCs that are open. Today, we're going to deep dive essentially into the RFC number 92, which is for essentially stage publishes. Quick housekeeping notes. We can go through some introductions here because I know there's some folks that haven't been on an RFC call yet before, but also want to note that these calls and all RFC interactivity is essentially operated under a code of conduct, which you can find on the actual RFC's repo at github.com/npm/RFCs. And essentially the desired outcome here is to hopefully further dig into a specific topic on these calls. And in this case, we're going to dig into the RFCs, the stage publishes RFC that was queued up by Daniel Sobel, but also championed by other folks here on the NPM side. And so, yeah, if we want to quickly go around and do a quick round of introductions, I can start. My name is Darcy Clark. I'm the engineering manager for community and open source here at NPM. And Roy, do you want to say hi?
Sure. Hi, my name is Roy. I work with Darcy in the open source team. I'm a software developer.
Awesome. Claudia, you want to say hi?
Hi, my name is Claudia, and I also work with Darcy and Roy on the open source team at NPM.
Isaac?
I am Isaac of NPM as well, working on the CLI and other open source things.
Awesome. Looks like Jordan, are you on a call? Can you say hi?
Hi, it was just a junk call. I'm Jordan. I'm a NPM package author, among other things, interested in staging.
Awesome. Wes?
Hey, I'm Wes, NPM package author. I think that's a nice way to say things. That's a good, I'll steal that. But also I work at Netflix on the build team. So, we do a bunch of stuff with trying to figure out better ways to support package publishing and stuff like that inside our infrastructure.
Awesome. Demetrius?
Hey, I'm Dom. I build things for clients at Nearform. I'm also a member of package maintenance team under Nodejs umbrella, and my interest here primarily is because the staging workflow enables NPM publish from CI while keeping the second factor for finalizing the publishing.
And you've done a ton of work there. We should note Dom's done a ton of work
on
package. Yeah. Michael?
I'm IBM's community lead for Nodejs, also participating in the package maintenance work.
Awesome. And Amelia?
I'm Amelia. I'm no longer actually at Quandu. I'm now on holidays for 3 months, so I've got plenty of time to contribute patches and things like that.
Yeah, I think this is the first RFC call where I think most folks are fully distributed and remote, probably based on circumstances out of our control. So that's awesome. Does anybody have any announcements they want to put out there before we dig in?
I think isn't the James Snell's work from home conf tomorrow? If anybody's interested, you should check it out. I think it's work from home, wfhconf.com. I had the website up earlier. I don't know if anybody has it. But.
Maybe Dom knows more about that.
Yeah, wfhconf.netlify.com.
Awesome. Good note. Cool. So if there's nothing else, we can dig in. So I put an initial agenda here in terms of trying to identify the initial scope that we want to stay within for this first set of work. Also trying to identify, I think use cases would be really good, because that's what seems to be you know, the talking points, and I think a bunch of people on this call have differing opinions or understandings of the use cases which they'd like to see this feature support. And then we can talk a bit about the nitty-gritty implementation details in terms of artifacts, in terms of you know APIs, in terms of that sort of thing. I know that Isaac has you know, been extremely active in this, sort of picking up from what Daniel initially first proposed. I'm not sure if you want to speak to the current state, as you were, I think, one of the last people, and or Wes were one of the last people to actually be you know, commenting on this RFC.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the thing that has made this one somewhat interesting and ripe for a deep dive is that we actually have a handful of different use cases, and depending on how we optimize for one or more of those use cases, we may end up sort of making it harder to deliver on some of the others. So my goal is to make sure that we can, you know, try to maximize our value proposition to our user base, and not have to, you know, and kind of do as good a job of addressing these disparate use cases as we can, and potentially leaving some of the more you know, targeted stuff, targeted use cases aside for a future RFC, or just identify them as something that we are going to only partially do or do in some specific way. And so the goal being that we're not going to, you know, do harm to any of those use cases by how we go about implementing this. As I see it, they essentially come down to a couple of things. The first is, you know, which was kind of the initial push for this, is the goal of publishing from CI and then having a subsequent step wherein a human being promotes that staged publish to the actual version. And there's quite a lot of devils in the details around you know, auth stuff. We've already established that anything about you know, any differences in authentication or authorization that are required to promote from staging to full publish is kind of a secondary concern, and it's essentially a registry, you know, a registry issue, right? From the CLI's point of view, it has no knowledge of who is allowed to do what. It just tries to do it, and either it can or it can't. Which is, you know, you don't want your authorization and authentication to live client side. You kind of want that to live server side. So from the point of view of this RFC, it's secondary. But that being said, if we want to deliver on that promise, that opens some doors for, you know, some questions for, like, how visible should staged publishes be? How easy should it be to fetch them? And what are the steps that a person is going to be likely to go through prior to, you know, to like vet something prior to promoting it to a full publish? And so there are some other use cases that kind of fell out of this, that were not the initial thinking that drove this feature, but were certainly, I think, valuable and worth considering. One of them is, and so I think these kind of fall into two different general categories. One of them is essentially a better way to push out a beta to users. So this is a thing that I've personally run into quite a few times in kind of interactions between folks working on TAP and folks working on the Istanbul side, because there's a lot of points of integration between those two projects, and both of them are made up of multiple different packages. So when we get into a case where NYC is working on a beta, or Istanbul is working on a beta for a new version, if I want to pull that into a working version of TAP, there are quite a few challenges that end up being presented when we just try to use dist tags and pre-release versions. because owing to two facts. One is when you publish something to a pre-release dist tag, it can still be pulled in by the normal kind of Semver resolutions, right? So if I say, you know, version 1 is on latest and version 2 is on next, that's fine because nobody who's depending on 1 is likely to get 2 by accident. But if I have 1 on latest and 1.4 on next, then if you're depending on, you know, caret 1.2, you're going to pick up that next version when maybe it's not actually ready for prime time yet. So the only way to avoid that is to use pre-release versions in Semver. The problem that comes there is it sort of swings too far to the other side of the spectrum, where it's now impossible to get new versions on that pre-release tag unless you're explicitly depending on the pre-release Semver range for each of those dependencies. And so, you know, if it's 1 or 2 things, it's not that bad. You just install the pre-release version and check and make sure everything works fine. But if you have something where NYC is depending on Istanbul, Istanbul reports, Istanbul this and that, TAP is depending on T-report and T-compare and everything else, then going through and updating all those things to have the proper Semver pre-release is pretty tricky. So this kind of the beta testing or beta pre-release use case really falls into 2 different categories, one being within my team and the other being people who use my package outside of my team, because I may want to also say, okay, do a, you know, npm install tap at next, and maybe even reach out to some external users and get them to just sort of easily pull this in. So if it's a huge onerous process for them to go through and do that, it's going to be much harder to sell them on it. You know, doing 3 seconds of work to try out a new version is fine. Doing 30 minutes is probably just, people won't do it. And so where we got into the weeds, I think, in the biggest way was how public should staged publishes be. Implementation wise, the easiest way to approach this is to say that they are just visible. And I think most of the technical blockers to that we've pretty much ironed out. It's going to require a little bit of registry work, but not a ton. If we wanted to say that pre-release versions are not possible to install, which may be safest if they're kind of if they're treated as a security issue, then that makes things a lot more challenging to do the beta testing use case, as well as imposing some, you know, harsher or more difficult server-side requirements on them. The solution that I proposed in the RFC, which is actually already implemented in npm pick manifest as just kind of a thing that I was playing with, is that we essentially deprioritize. So unless you do include staged, you never see staged versions. And even if you do, they are fully deprioritized. So you'll only get a staged version if it's the only thing that satisfies, and nothing else does. So yeah, that's kind of my spiel. I see that Jordan's hand is up. I will yield the floor.
So I originally raised my hand because I was thinking, oh, well, if this is a use case you have, why don't you, like, in your string of deps, like, say, like, caret 1.2.3 or a pre-release including Semver, and then I realized why that wouldn't work, because then regular users would get it. It wouldn't be opt-in. It would be, like, forced almost. Or so, like, but I feel like maybe this is what the use case you're describing is valid and worth solving. It's not one I typically have, but it seems completely plausible to me. But to me, that isn't what staging should be. Is to me that, like, it's more like you're looking for more, like, this is almost like resolutions. You're almost saying, like, for a series of dependencies, I want to replace the normal Semver range with one that includes this pre-release. And I want to do that for the whole graph so that I can test all of these things in a way that won't expose them to everyone, but that doesn't force me to go through 37 dependencies and update, you know, and publish pre-releases. And that seems like a really useful thing to make easy to do. Not necessarily, and I'm not even saying, oh, therefore you need to have this be full resolutions. I'm saying like that is a similar feature to that, as opposed to what I think of as staging, and what the package maintenance working group, I believe, thought of as staging when we discussed this a while ago, which is like, staging is saying like, I have a private secret place where I am preparing my publish, the thing that everyone's going to see. And as soon as I'm ready, I publish it. And like a blog post, a WordPress blog post is staged. Nobody can see it except the editor, the authors. And then when they click publish, it's immediately public, and that's it. It's binary. It's staged or it's public, right? And so like, I'm wondering if perhaps the name staging is a misname for like an improper name for the feature you want, which is worth doing, and like, and maybe that's part of the confusion here, and that these are actually two completely distinct use cases that probably have some overlap in functionality, but the implementation detail is irrelevant when we're talking, I think, when we're talking about the RFC, which is like the semantics of it. And I think these are two very distinct semantic features that are going to be used by different constituencies in different ways and at different times. And also sometimes used together. But like, I think the current RFC conflates the two.
So there's, yeah, I mean, you're talking about like a draft publish almost more, you know, if we just sort of like remove the word staging out of it and just say this is like a draft publish that is not been made public.
Correct.
I think the metaphor falls down a little bit, even because even a WordPress draft, like the purpose of doing a draft in WordPress or Tumblr or Medium is so that I can send out that link to a bunch of people. It's not public on my website, but I can send you a link to it and get your feedback. So it may even still be a way to address, like it may even still have the same kind of implication, right? That like, well, I'm publishing a draft. It's not kind of for public consumption, but the folks that I reach out to and say, hey, can you install this thing and see if it breaks your build or not?
I think the gray area there is because the WordPress URL for that draft is not discoverable or guessable in any way. It's or computable. So like, it's not actually that much of a hazard to make it viewable to whoever has the link. Whereas a package name and an upcoming version number is highly guessable and like discoverable. So like, I think that there's probably some way that could be mitigated, but if that were mitigated, I agree with you. Like, it's not that the draft publish must never be accessible. It's that it must only be accessible to those who I've told to access it.
Right.
So sorry.
So the difference in the implementation as it stands, at least kind of the proof of concept as it stands today, is that it would be a thing if you were to look at the document, you could see, hey, there is a draft publish. I'm going to go and run npm install -- staged or -- include staged to pull it in. But it would still be opt-in, and it'd be almost impossible to get by accident. So it's not something that like someone would stumble over. You kind of have to go.
I mean, you may be underestimating the number of copy-paste commands that still get people installing NVM wrong 7 years later from tutorials.
I don't think I'd be surprised.
I just want to note,
so people are going to find these staged commands and they're going to update version numbers blindly. Like it's just going to happen.
Wes, go ahead. I know you have your hand raised.
Well, yeah. So we have two things we're sort of talking about here, and I want to just make sure we don't tie them together too tightly. So I think Jordan is really trying to get in the auth piece, which is fine, and I think that's a valid thing to discuss. I personally don't care so much about that. I think as long as it is like, actually maybe originally, Jordan, you were really going for the like, it should be only installable by the publishers. But I think it sounds like maybe you backtracked a little bit and said, actually, maybe it'd be fine if it was like the WordPress URL where it's non-guessable. Then we're not worried about the auth as much. We're more worried about the inability for somebody to accidentally couple to a stage, right?
Yeah, I would categorize those two positions as ideal and like, and I'll take it.
Okay. So
yeah,
my vote would definitely be for the I'll take it one, which is as long as it's not easily foot gun, territory, that is where I'm super in favor. And then going back to, and I'd really like to make sure we deeply go into this, is resolutions of some sort, which I don't want to say like go do what Yarn does, because I actually have problems with that I'd like to maybe discuss as a separate RFC. But that feature with a dist tag actually to me sounds like it really well solves, Isaac, what you laid out as your important use case, which again, I also agree, great use case. Beta testing things is something we should have a better solution for than we have today, which is, kind of like, well, dist tags, good luck. But I think that a combination of dist tags, so if you did like the next tag on a pre-release and then had resolutions to say, resolve everything that is NYC to dist tag next, right? That would actually be a really easy workflow, especially if you could do that, through one install command. That would, I think, fully satisfy your use case. And then we would be able to maybe decouple these and ship something that does maybe not auth, but not easily guessable install commands. And then just the pure initial intent feature, which was have a staging area for a CI publish workflow. Right? If we pull those two things fully apart, I think we actually get to like the staging thing, and maybe we have to rename it or whatever, being just what we initially intended, which is to enable the CI workflow. It'd be easy. It'd be not an authentication problem or nightmare on the CL or on the registry side. And then also we can tackle the really important feature, which is, how do we beta test package releases as a separate thing in another RC? I don't know if people like decoupling those as much as I do, but to me, that really makes this conversation a lot easier.
So the another I think problem with the metaphor of the WordPress draft. If you want to send me a non-guessable link to a non-guessable URL to a WordPress draft that you're working on, that's reasonable. However, I don't have to then load 10 other WordPress drafts in order to read your draft, right? So it's if those URLs aren't in some fashion, resolvable by the CLI, then we run into the problem where, okay, I need you to run this, 1,000-character long npm install and all of NYC's dependencies and so on. And again, this is also sort of a challenge with approaching this with something like resolutions, where there would have to be a convenient way to specify, like, not just package by package, but for an entire branch of the tree, right? That all of these things I want to pull in, anything that is depended upon by any staged package should also be allowing the staged versions to be pulled in. Now we may actually be able to do that in a relatively straightforward way with relatively little change to the current implementation by just changing how that include staged config value is handled. So instead of it being a Boolean that applies to the entire npm install command, we could make it a string that says, I want to include the staged version of, I want to do npm install tap at next -- include staged, or -- include staged equals tap. And so tap and all of its dependencies and all of their dependencies will pull in the staged versions, but you have to specify specifically, like, I wish to get the staged version of tap and everything it depends on, which would, take us down from 99% likely to not get by accident to, 99.9% likely to.
Well, and especially if it allows you to target a specific stage, like if I can stage 3 things and then do 3 different install commands that install each of those to test them all and compare them, like, that starts to be a really powerful thing that is akin to a resolutions-like feature without stepping on the toes of that feature.
Right.
And
without
that seems,
requiring you to know every dependency of tap in order to pull in the
right.
stage.
Yeah, that seems a lot easier to me. And then I agree that there's still some of my discoverability concerns and like copy paste concerns still apply to that, but the scope of that damage would be drastically reduced, and like all the fallback behavior you've sketched out for what happens when the real version gets published and the stages go away. It also seems like it would address that a bit. And it could also perhaps give, instead of fallbacks, it could just give an error message and be like, that stage version you're trying to install doesn't exist anymore. Don't do that. Right? There's like a possibility for, go ahead.
If you do npm install tap at 15 -- include staged, or -- include staged equals tap. What that would do is try to resolve version 15 of tap, including whatever staged versions are there, but at the bottom of the list. So essentially, it makes a list of all the versions that satisfy the spec that you provided, and then it sorts them by, I don't recall actually the order of this. I think it sorts them first by whether or not they're deprecated, and then by whether or not they're staged. So, or it could be the other way around. Anyway, it goes basically all of the non-deprecated, non-staged versions, then all the deprecated versions that are not staged, then all the staged versions. So the impact of that is when the staged versions get promoted, you just start getting the promoted version that satisfies your Semper range. Like the include staged basically starts being a no-op.
But we could warn and say like your staging command, like override is no longer necessary, even if it just silently still works, right?
We could do that.
Because like I would want to push people away from using the staging command unnecessarily.
We would probably, yeah, sure. We would probably still want to sort of cascade it down the dependency graph, because I might promote tap before NYC is out of staging. That would be obviously not something I ought to do, but it will probably happen. Or I may want to say, like, I want to pull in the staged versions of all of tap's dependencies. There may be a patch version that's being staged, right? And so I want to make sure that patch is actually a bug fix and not going to break something. So even though it's not a strictly required, it's still not actually work. Stop myself there. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we can work that out, right? Like,
but we could kind of have a specific package name or set of package names that it will, anything starting from here and onward will include stage versions.
But essentially, if the ethos is that we're going to agree on are, you have to explicitly opt in to be able to get to install stage things. When the stage things get promoted, the installs will continue to work, even if they perhaps warn you that the stage is no longer, are there.
The way I would approach it is to say, hey, you specified include staged, but you didn't actually pull in any staged versions of anything. So
yeah,
this is not necessary. But then if it cascaded and we did end up pulling in a staged version of some meta dependency, we don't warn you, because it is still necessary.
Yeah, so and that's cool. And then the other ethos would be trying to minimize the scope of staged versions that you're targeting while retaining the convenience needed for your tap, NYC, et cetera use case.
So,
and then the implementation details of that we can shake out.
Well, so isn't that why, that's kind of why I was saying at next in the include stage, right? Because you want to say, it's not just tap at 15. You might have a staged version of different patches, right? Oh, I guess you could then do tap at 15.1 include stage tap. Okay, But
you might have like 6 different 15.1 staged versions and you want to pick one of them, right? So, but like, I would hope there's a way to target those.
Yeah, so the thing is, because of the sorting, if there's a 15.1 which is not staged and a 15.1.2 that is staged, you're going to get the properly published one if it matches the Semper range. So,
so you have to be explicit.
You have to be super explicit to ever get a staged version in the first place.
That's great.
Would it be worth perhaps adding some sort of redirect to the staged versions in the registry to say, hey, you went to try and install this staged version, but this staged version has now been published as version XYZ, to redirect people and resolve that staged version to an actual published version?
So I can go through some of the plans that I think make the most sense. We did a lot of back and forth of hashing this out with like what do the dist tags, what do the dist URLs actually look like? I can't really find any serious problems with this. If we're gonna if we assume that like for the time being, okay, this like include staged equals package name is acceptable to kind of reduce the scope of the potential foot guns. Then there's the question of what gets saved into the package lock JSON and how do we sort of like make builds, minimize build breakage while also handling cases where I pushed a new staged version of at the same version number. Maybe one of my beta testers found some critical problem. I fixed it and I staged a new version with the same Semver version. And so this is also sort of owing to some registry architecture decisions whereby a published tarball artifact is essentially a permanent thing, right? The URL that we have for that artifact will never change. And this is actually super important for cacheability, for downstream mirrors, not to get screwed up and so on. So I definitely want to continue to keep this the way that it is. And what that means is the URL for the staged tarball, the best way to do that is to no longer use the version number as kind of the name and version number is kind of the key, because that obviously now is going to be something that could change prior to being promoted. So my thought there is we essentially put a URL safe version of the integrity of the artifact integrity into the URL. And then, so the staged tarball URL would look something like registry npmjs.org/package name /hyphen/staged/ content address /foo-1.2.3.tdz.
Could you, sorry, Isaac, could you write that out just for note keeping?
Yes, sorry.
And in chat also.
What about making all package URLs content addressed?
Well, so that is a thing
that's a good question
that we could do, right? Because then what we could also do is say that URL will, we can put a cache timeout of 10 years on that, right? And let our CDN hold it forever or whatever. Anybody who caches that URL, we're not gonna have to worry about some new thing showing up there and having to invalidate caches along the way and so on. And if we wanted to eventually move to having a fully kind of content address style URL for all of our artifacts, we could totally do that. There are some advantages, and there are some places where we take advantage of the fact that that registry tarball artifacts have a consistent shape. And so I'd want to be really careful about that kind of a move and be really clear about what it actually buys us. But I think having the name and version number is kind of the only dependencies on the fully published version would be fine. And that URL would just basically 404 until it's been fully promoted. Sorry, so write this out.
So when you said tarball URLs never change, but when I unpublish something, the tarball URL's deleted, right? Or
it becomes a 404, but you will never have a new thing at that tarball URL.
Okay, so
right. So it'll either be
would that be the same? What if I want my staged versions to be deleted, as opposed to is that how it already is planning to happen?
Yeah,
they'll be unpublished when I promote.
So when you promote, no, that content address would keep working. But if you staged a new version, a new instance of the same version number, we would delete the old content address.
Wait, so I can't have two different 15.1 candidates at the same time? Why?
Because we punted on that.
historical, we were considering that you could queue up many of the same staged copies of the same thing, and then we were like, let's just clobber, like stage versions would work very similar to versions, except that it was mutable. That's just the history. Like we can revisit whether.
But like what that means is that if I have like 3 different potential bug fixes and I want to test them in C2, that means that I have to try one and then delete that and try the next one.
Against your CI running wild and queuing up 20 of the same version. So I mean, we can discuss that, but that's like a Dom, I saw your hand was raised for a second there. If you want to jump in.
Yep. Yeah, just had a note there. Since we're talking about deleting things, should we automatically delete stage versions if they don't get published within X? So suppose you stage something and after a month it's not published. It just
how long do we leave it there?
I don't know. It's just a month. I made up a month.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, we hadn't really considered that. I think that it's worth.
That seems like very much a policy thing.
Pros and cons, yeah.
Yeah.
So the reason I was thinking about it is that, especially if we go not only the mutable but multiple versions thing, is that people are going to. I mean, maybe it's too much control and not letting people hack, but the intent for these staged versions is to get published or not exist. So the publish and not exist part, it can be enforced, right? It can be done on the registry side, so maybe it's not on part of this discussion, but it seems to me that if you don't publish a version that you staged, then, and it starts to live on for a long time, people would just start using the staged version, especially if it's an important bug fix, and then that staged version becomes essentially ingrained and it becomes legacy and it can never be removed. And
never gets promoted to
and never gets promoted. Yeah,
I see what you're saying. But then that would also entail that somebody is using the flagged like include stage as well.
And then they would have to use these flags.
Yeah.
Well, all that means is one person did it, and then every other developer just installs from the lock file after that. So the con of putting it in the lock file is that only one person needs to do it, right? Or do you need to use that command every time?
Once it's in the lock, what goes in the lock file is the URL to the tarball.
Right. So what that means is that include staged is only a requirement for one person once, and then never again in that repo. And so for 3 years, they could install a staged version without anyone knowing it.
I think that you were kind of alluding to warning messaging, Jordan, there. I think that's one caveat that we want to prevent against in terms of if you're downloading a staged version, we'd want, without using the include staging because the package lock had it, then we'd want to be warning for that. And or to Dom's point, potentially there's policies in place that eventually that goes away, like access somehow, or that thing goes away.
I think we should really consider putting it in the lock file. This is going to break people if we do that. I think there's no way to avoid it if we put it in the lock file.
That also means that I can just publish a shrink wrap, and all of my go ahead.
Like what is the breaking people that happens if it's in the lock file? Let's dig into that.
So first is so there's a few different ways here. So we've brought up a few things since we initially talked about this that maybe will help mitigate some of it. So if the install fails when dash includes staged is not passed and a staged version is in the lock file, that would break a build, right? Because again, to Jordan's point, it takes one person running it one time for everybody on the team to get it. And if they're not passing include stage. Now, that said, if we don't require that, then we won't break the build now, but we have a possible long-term, mistake. And say, so a mistake, obviously not a broken build, but I think it's also something we should strongly, try to prevent people from doing, especially when it'd be such a transparent mistake, right? They wouldn't even know that they're still relying on a staged version. A warning is one thing, but if you look at some of the projects I see in our company, there's hundreds of warnings. Like you're not going to notice the one stage thing in the 40 lines of warnings, and then if you have one node JIP failure in there, then your whole thing's blown up, and you're probably just ignoring it, right? So I think it's maybe not, that's in that case it's maybe not breaking, but it is really, I think, an undesirable outcome. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Are you done, Wes? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there.
Well, in a way that would be
makes
breaking is if a new version is staged, never promoted, and then later deleted. And then no one ever publishes a new version that replaces it. Now everyone who depended on that staged version is broken forever. And that's different than unpublishing, because you would, if that's a good thing, cool, but then that's still breakage that the developer who included staged in the first place might have left the company, and then you have 1,000 people for 4 years who have been relying on this, and then all of a sudden it stops working and no one knows why, because it was a staged build.
So just in terms of folks going, Don, you had your hand raised, and then Michael has his hand.
Cool. Okay, so I'll go on the other side. If we do not include it in the package log, then it becomes really tricky to use it to try it out in other places, because all of a sudden you need to modify your CI config. So suppose you have, well, what's the example we're using? Suppose you have a new version, stage version of NYC, you want to use it in TAP. All of a sudden you have to modify TAP's CI config to change the npm install command so that you can take that other thing in if it's using the package log. So I can see an argument saying that you should be jumping through hoops to get that in. Fair enough.
That's what I was going to say, but I agree that is a definite larger hurdle to use this feature. We should be very clear if we think that is worth having. I agree.
So I think that if we set the expectation right about the stage version getting removed, just going to play with the idea, right? Then every time you install, you could see that it's getting removed soon. If somebody staged it and it got removed, whoever staged it, they know that it will get removed. I mean, things do happen, things do move away. But as well, if the package did get removed and we still have some metadata that it was staged at some earlier point, then we can also give a remediation saying, there was a staged version. It's no longer there because it expired. You can go use this other version. Right, but I don't think that there is a way to avoid these stage versions getting into package JSONs or package JSON, package log JSON. Right, if it's in a package JSON, not even in the log file, then we have to respect it, right? If it's pinned to a specific version, which is still staged, right? We still have to respect that, right?
Well, I want to actually dig into something that Dom said. Like, if I want to try out this this new version and see if the bug fix fixes my bug, then I run npm install -- include stage, blah blah blah. It updates my log file, and I go, great, everything looks works on my machine. Let me push it to CI to see if it works there too. Like, what I actually want is the log file to pull the URL for the tarball that has the thing that I'm testing locally. Now, if it eventually is either replaced with a new version staged at that version number, then that previous artifact will be deleted and it'll 404. Great, okay, it's a thing I have to fix. If it's promoted, then the content address didn't change, and I still get the same artifact with the same integrity at the same URL. And yeah, it's kind of not the canonical official just version number of that URL, but it's fine. And we can even have it return a 301 moved or something if we want to tell npm to resolve it at this other location instead. And that can actually just automatically update the log file because now my resolution changes. So I don't know, like, keeping it out of the log file, it seems like it only speaks to this goal of I want to make sure that nobody fetches staged things. Even machines fetch staged things without kind of that explicit opt-in at the install command, which I don't know. It feels like feels like a little bit of an overreach, because now if I want to try out that thing, I have to actually not just install it, test it, push it. I have to install it, test it, update my Travis CI or my GitHub Actions workflow install command, and it's just like much more work.
Michael, you had your hand up. Do you want?
Yeah, it's just, you know, the earlier suggestion of having the staging versions be removed early strikes me as something that would help with the problems we're discussing, in that, you know, if there was like a fairly short time period, like a week, so, you know, the staged, if it was either published, or if it's not published in a week, it's going to go away, you would find those kind of problems quickly and hopefully before it's going to have a large impact. And it also seems consistent with, we're not trying to introduce a new way of getting it packages forever, right? It's like, this is a small, you know, we just want them to be staged until we can promote them. I can see the use case of saying, well, we want to let people test them out, but it seems totally reasonable to say that's a very short-term thing, 1 week or less. And hopefully that helps to mitigate some of the problems that, if they are in these other files, that people discover it sooner than later.
It also avoids the problem of, so there's a fairly large contingent of folks who do not appreciate the benefits of having a name-at version be a permanent single artifact, and occasionally gripe that, well, how come you're making me bump my version number? And so if we said, well, you know, you can install stage, like, I think what we could unfortunately very, very well end up with is not so much a foot gun, but just like, the way you install this thing is you do npm install foo at 1.0 -- include staged, and a new version will never be published. It's 1.0.0 forever, right? And that's actually not great, because what that means then is, like, we don't have that kind of really nice ability to track back and say, here was, you know, this is a semver bump, and like, this is the version number that it was. And if we had a week feels short to me. Yeah, I'm with Amelia. I would lean more towards like a month. But then also we could at least still say, and we could print a warning. It's like, hey, you've staged a version on X date. It will disappear if you have not promoted it since then. And that would also kind of keep our storage sort of within a reasonable kind of range as a result of this feature.
So just in terms of hands up, Jordan and then Wes, if you can.
So I had 2 comments. One was perhaps to mitigate the breakage that would happen when a staged version goes away, the lock file should store 2 URLs, the staged tarball and the non-staged tarball. And that way you don't have to like alter the lock file in order to have the tarball that you would fall back to. How that is also relevant is my second comment, which is staged versions in a package lock, like, it's dev only, who cares, fine, right? Like, there's use cases around that for like an app, for, you know, a company's monorepo, things like that, but like it's not going to infect the ecosystem because it's package lock. But npm shrink wrap is just a different name of package lock that does infect the ecosystem. Can we somehow make it so that staged versions don't work when they're in a published shrink, like when they're inside node modules? And perhaps having both URLs in the tarball would be a really trivial way to do that.
So the tricky thing, having both URLs in the tarball is trickier than it sounds, just because of some assumptions sort of throughout the system that a thing resolves to a single thing. I mean, it's software, it can be changed, but
Cool. Wes, did you want to, are you topping up on that, or?
Sure, a little bit. Actually, I think the 2 URLs solve some interesting problems. So I think we should consider that more. So I don't want to totally change topics. But I think going back to if we auto expire them and say we do a month, you have a build that's been working for a month and now suddenly it's broken, is really a tough scenario to put people in. So I think I'd actually err on the side of go way too short to very forcibly prevent people from like pushing something and going home for the day and then having the CI be broken. Like, it'd be better if it was like broken that day like within a couple of hours. So they're very clearly aware, oh yeah, I pushed today a staged version. That's probably what broke the build, which is a lot harder to do a month later. So
yeah, we might take, I mean, you could pin this against our unpublished policy. So 72 hours would be, you know, we have something that we've already decided that there's a policy with some sort of time limit, and we aren't creating something out of nothing in terms of, you know, arbitrarily deciding a timeline. We already have a policy for unpublished, and we've decided that 72 hours is, you know, what we're going to pin that against. Maybe we could utilize that as a time if we are going to go down that road.
that would make sense to me, because that would then align really well with folks knowing that within 72 hours, things can change. And that would make it
with mutability, then you could always restage.
Right, that's what I was thinking. You know, you can restage if you want the person didn't get a chance to test it in time.
Any thoughts? Anybody else on this?
Yeah, my only concern there, I mean, there is the restage that does work. My only concern there is that it probably works in a commercial business setting, because that's your day job and you look at things day in, day out. Whereas in open source world, things move a bit slower, especially if you're asking somebody to review something. And
I'll get to that this weekend, like is a common response.
Yeah, well, and I think though we should come back to the core concept that or the reason why this became something is because we were like, oh, we're dealing with so many automated systems. We would hope that you could create another automated system to restage whatever it is if you don't get to it in time.
I think like a check, like if you had like say a GitHub action, right? And you had your GitHub action, which said if a, you know, PR with this pattern is merged, do a staged, right, stage a release. You could then just say in that same action, oh, we also have a cron job, and that cron will check to see if it is not yet published and not yet merged to master, then continually re-stage every day, right? Or something like that. And that'd be a fairly easy setup that would get us really close to what we want, even for the open source use case where we might want it to sit for a month.
What about doing something sort of like the, what do you call it, two-factor auth code prompt, where automatically after 72 hours, you have to go to it, the package will fail to install unless you go to an open a URL, click on the link to say, yes, I actually want to install this version, just to sort of add a step. And it's still there and it would still work. And then just one person in your organization or your team or your project needs to click that URL and it reactivates it.
So two things on that. Just we're getting close to time. I know Jordan has his hand up, and I've got a couple things to get to just before we close out on this. But if you have to drop off, thank you for joining because we are at time. Jordan, if you want to top up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure the point about shrink wrap isn't lost. I think it's really important that it not be possible to publish a module that other people can then unwittingly be made to install staged versions.
I'm actually not convinced that that's such a bad thing. So if I publish a shrink wrap, now it is a bad thing, obviously, if that staged version is going to disappear without being promoted. Right. That being said, like, what if the thing that I'm shrink wrapping is itself a staged version, and like it needs to pull in the staged copies of stuff, right? Like, what if I want to stage a version of npm 7?
But if you're trying to install a staged version that has a shrink wrap, you'd need the staged command anyway, and then it would cascade. So.
Right, but again, the include stage command is only about version resolution against the package. It's not about does the URL work. The URL works, right. Like it's out there, and we give up a lot in terms of efficiency if we try to make too many conditions on that thing working. We can delete it easily enough and refresh the caches, but having other mechanisms like, you know, putting other hooks on it gets kind of tricky. Yeah, I think only the auto expiring makes it so that the shrink wrap thing, I mean, it'll just break, right? Like if you have a staged version in your shrink wrap and that's not the version that ends up getting promoted, like, okay, your install breaks. That feels like enough of a blocker to me to prevent it. Now, if the stage thing did get promoted, then the content address URL would just keep working because we would just flip that on for all things. And maybe even move towards using that as the de facto kind of URL since it has integrity baked right into it, which is kind of nice. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to be mindful here again. We are sort of beyond time, and I apologize. We got started late. That's on me. There's two things that we should get to. I know that this RC originally was kicked off by Daniel. I'm looking for somebody to champion this going forward so that we can get some updates actually to it, based on the fact that I think we've talked a lot about implementation details here, which aren't at all defined in the RC as it stands today. So I'm not sure, Isaac, if you want to essentially take over ownership of this PR as it stands today, or we cut a new PR with based on some of the feedback that has been going on in the RC. Might be something that's actionable from this talk.
Yeah, I've been taking some notes about specific ideas that are being floated here that I think are feasible, and I will draft up a summary this afternoon and also try to make some time to update the RFC itself, the RFC markdown itself.
Okay, that'd be ideal, just to essentially make some of this a bit more actionable. We can actually see, I think there's a lot of good pieces in what we've talked about just in this call alone, in terms of, time to live, or like essentially an expiry of stage packages sounds interesting. The way in which that actually gets action on, or like, whether it goes away, access is forbidden, or we have some sort of like prompt, I think is like a nuanced detail that we can talk about in the actual RFC. But if we can actually update based on the fact that the initial RFC was very broad, very, very broad, and some of the terminology that we're using is not in the current RFC, including include staged, even that kind of change will get us closer to getting consensus, I think. So, but yeah, with that in mind, I just wanted to say thanks for everybody for jumping on this call. Hopefully we can continue to have these discussions. We're also pretty active. The NPM team is pretty active on different Slack channels as well. Node tooling, Slack org, as well as the OpenJS Foundation org, as well as the Node Slack org. There's NPM channels in all three of those Slack sort of teams or orgs, whatever you want to call it. So, we can chat in there, or we can also have discussions in the actual RFC itself. And if Isaac, you can take that as a takeaway to maybe take ownership of this one. Hopefully we can, move this along. Appreciate again everybody joining, and we'll see you next week if you join us for the next Open RFC call. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.